So we're sticking with the original topic of John Henry Newman and the role of the laity. Now, the cardinal mistake, as it were, in thinking of Newman's theology of the laity is to assume he had one. At least, that's what I want to suggest in this paper. Or, to be precise, what I want to argue is that while at one stage of his development, Newman did try, not wholly successfully, to tease out a characteristic and distinctive role for the laity, in the radical ecclesiology that he fought his way into in the 1870s, that distinctive role disappeared altogether, and layfolk, like the clergy, became simply transparent to the church. Of course, we can find Newman saying all sorts of nice things about the laity, but that's not the same thing as having a distinctive theology of the laity. Cardinal Wiseman notoriously had a view on their distinctive role. The only duty of the laity is to pay. Newman's long-standing enemy in Rome, the influential, greasy, and intriguing Monsignor George Talbot, had one too. What is the province of the laity, he wrote to Manning, to hunt, to shoot, to entertain? These matters they understand, but to meddle with ecclesiastical matters they have no right at all. But not Newman. Take a well-known anecdote. In 1859, on the 22nd of May, Newman was being hauled politely over the coals by Bernard Ullathorne, the Bishop of Birmingham. Ullathorne, his closest friend by far on the episcopal bench, frequently his patron and protector. The Rambler, of which Newman was, for a short and rather disastrous period that summer, editor, was upsetting the laity of England. He said something like, "Who are the laity?" I answered that the church would look foolish without them. Not those words. It's a flippant remark. It's obviously taking a benign view of the laity, but it's not making any particular claims about what they can or should be doing. We'll return to the Rambler in a moment, but we begin not with the embattled Newman of 1859, but with the earnest and rather priggish young Anglican clergyman of 1832. That's the first of our three ports of call. The second will be 1859, and the third, 1877. At the end of 1832, Hurrell Froude, who exerted such a pull on the Anglican Newman in a high church and ultimately Catholic with a small c direction. Hurrell Froude and his father were going to the Mediterranean for the younger Froude's health. He was to die of TB 4 years later. And they persuaded Newman to join them. It was the first time JHN had been abroad, and as he wrote from Rome, less than halfway through the trip, I sincerely hope never to go abroad again. He saw Greece and Malta and Italy and discovered that foreign lands were distressingly full of foreigners. I found pleasure in historical sites and beautiful scenes, not in men and manners, as he says in the Apologia. His letters of the period are, though, much more nuanced than that carefully manicured and rather self-mocking passage of the Apologia would suggest. On the whole, he actually liked Italy and Italians, though Naples and Neapolitans were hard work. Naples is a disappointing place, he wrote to Tom Mosley in March of '33. It has nothing to recommend it, but its ices, which are capital. Its ices and clean white tablecloths and napkins. There, as he wrote to his sister Harriet, we find a population from high to low, as it appears, immersed in the most despicable frivolity and worst profligacy, which is so much connected with religious observances as to give the city the character of a pagan worship. Or, as he wrote to his mother in April of 1833, and again, the people are dissolute and heathen, certainly. I am much offended at what struck us, more because here we saw it first, the very irreverent exhibitions of the crucifix and of souls in purgatory, which are stuck about as puffs are on the London walls. I think the popular and exoteric religion as nearly pagan as you can fancy. But I really have found the people very civil and good-natured, though knaves. That, of course, is the world Newman would have to think to make his peace with after his reception into the church 12 years later. Now let's fast forward back to 1859. The Rambler had been conceived as the organ of an educated Catholic laity. The editors, Richard Simpson and Sir John Acton, had fallen foul of the hierarchy, which was actually quite easy to do. Wiseman and Ullathorne appealed to Newman to take over the editorship. His first issue was that of May 1859. The animating principle of the revamped review was to be the refinement, enlargement, and elevation of the intellect in the educated classes. It was to combine devotion to the church with discrimination and candor in the treatment of her opponents, to reconcile freedom of thought with implicit faith, and to encourage a manly investigation of subjects of public interest under a deep sense of the prerogatives of ecclesiastical authority. Elevation of the intellect in the educated classes, a manly investigation. The Rambler may have been too heady a mix with bishops, but it of course expressed a Victorian set of values of class and patriarchy. How could it be otherwise? Newman, in any event, was treading carefully. That May number, which sold about 800 copies, contained an article on Gothic architecture, one on ancient saints, and a fulsome eulogy of Cardinal Wiseman, extolling the lectures and sermons he had delivered on his recent tour of Ireland. All very bland and anodyne stuff, one might think. But it was all still too much for Ullathorne. It was that issue that he was taking Newman to task for when they had their argument about the laity. The church would look foolish without them. The problem was that Newman had inadvertently become embroiled in the tangled question of Catholic cooperation with the Royal Commission, the Newcastle Commission, that was then looking into the provision of primary education, a question on which the Rambler had expressed strong views in the past. Deep in the small print, in the double-columned editorial notes stuck away towards the back of the issue, Newman wrote, and this is 1.1 on your handout, acknowledging then most fully the prerogatives of the episcopate, we do unfeignedly believe that their lordships really desire to know the opinion of the laity on subjects in which the laity are especially concerned. If even in the preparation of a dogmatic definition the faithful are consulted, as lately in the instance of the Immaculate Conception, it is at least as natural to anticipate such an act of kind feeling and sympathy in great practical questions, out of the condescension which belongs to those who are forma facti gregis ex animo, the form of the flock fashioned after their mindset. Even in the preparation of a dogmatic definition, the faithful are consulted. He's referring, of course, to the memorials that were solicited from various lay groups, among others, lobbying for the definition of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception by Pius IX in 1854. But what did the word consulted mean there? It was at once seized on by the zealous John Gillow, professor of theology at Ushall. In a letter to Gillow, Newman had to resort to a bit of special pleading. He meant consult in the sense in which, he claimed, we regularly speak in ordinary English of consulting the barometer to see what the weather is doing. It doesn't mean you ask the barometer what its opinion is. It means you check the barometer to determine a matter of fact, and you then use that piece of factual information in forming your conclusion. Gillow was temporarily satisfied. Ullathorne remained uneasy, though he and Newman parted on good terms at the end of that the church would look foolish without them conversation. Newman was to oversee only one more issue of the Rambler, Volume 1, Part 2, the July number. That had been agreed during that same discussion with Oglethorpe on the 22nd of May. He used his swan song to return to the issue of consulting the faithful. The article, a long one, was meant in part to pacify his critics by explaining, or explaining away, what he had said. But it was also meant to silence them by bringing out the heavy artillery of his patristic learning. If his editorship, and perhaps even the Rambler itself, were to sink, he would at least go down with all guns blazing. His first book, finished just before the Italian trip, had been the Arians of the 4th century. It was a period and a topic that he was thoroughly at home in. And the meat of On Consulting the Faithful is two collections of well-documented texts, one illustrating the pusillanimity and vacillation of the bishops, and the other the steadfastness of the lay faithful in the face of the threat from imperially sponsored heresy in the mid-4th century. Let me take you through the passages on your handout. 1.2 from On Consulting the Faithful. I think I am right in saying that the tradition of the apostles, committed to the whole church and its various constituents and functions, per modum unius, as an organic whole, we might say, manifests itself variously at various times, sometimes by the mouth of the episcopacy, sometimes by the doctors, sometimes by the people, sometimes by liturgies, rites, ceremonies, and customs, by events, disputes, movements, and all those other phenomena which are comprised under the name of history. The people are a mirror in which the bishops see themselves, and note the oppositions he sets up. Well, I suppose a person may consult his glass, and in that way may know things about himself which he can learn in no other way. It is not a little remarkable that, though, historically speaking, the 4th century is the age of doctors, nevertheless, in that very day, the divine tradition committed to the infallible church was proclaimed and maintained far more by the faithful than by the episcopate. In that time of immense confusion, the divine dogma of our Lord's divinity was proclaimed, enforced, maintained, and humanly speaking preserved, far more by the Ecclesia Docta, the taught church, and by the Ecclesia Docens, the teaching church. That the body of the episcopate was unfaithful to its commission, while the body of the laity was faithful to its baptism. And at the heart of the piece, 1.6 on your handout, I shall set down some authorities for the 2 points successively which I have to enforce. Namely, that the Nicene dogma was maintained during the greater part of the 4th century. 1, not by the unswerving firmness of the Holy See, councils, or bishops, but 2, by the consent of the faithful. On the one hand, then, I say that there was a temporary suspense of the functions of the teaching church. The body of bishops failed in their confession of faith. And that's followed by 22 examples, mainly drawn from the accounts in the 5th century church historians of 4th century Arianism. Now we come secondly to the proofs of the fidelity of the laity and the effectiveness of that fidelity, with 21 examples. Those were fateful words. All would have been well, he wrote a week after his uncomfortable interview with Oglethorpe. All would have been well, but for the unlucky paragraph in my July number on the Arianizing hierarchy. He tried, at least on the surface, to be emollient in the article. I am not supposing that such times as the Arian will ever come again. As to the present, certainly, if there ever was an age which might dispense with the testimony of the faithful, and leave the maintenance of the truth to the pastors of the church, it is the age in which we live. Yet each constituent portion of the church has its proper functions, and no portion can safely be neglected. Though the laity be but the reflection or echo of the clergy in matters of faith, yet there is something in the pastorum et fidelium conspiratio, the breathing together of pastors and faithful, which is not in the pastors alone. I think certainly that the teaching church is more happy when she has such enthusiastic partisans about her as are here represented. than when she cuts off the faithful from the study of her divine doctrines and the sympathy of her divine contemplations, and requires from them an implicit faith in her word, which in the educated classes will terminate in indifference, and in the poorer, in superstition. Superstition. For Newman, the archetypal vice of a debased religion, especially the debased religion of the lower classes. In Rome in 1833, though he had seen much to admire, he had been horrified by the superstitions, or rather what is far worse, the solemn reception of them as an essential part of Christianity, as he wrote to his friend Christie on the 7th of March, 1833. Now, in On Consulting the Faithful, we can see J.H.N. groping his way toward the articulation of a theology of the laity, one that would give them a distinctive and fundamental role as the passive guardians of a sense of the faith. To assess a dogmatic proposition, to see whether it is or is not an integral part of the faith, you run it by the laity and see their reaction. The laity are a sort of gigantic focus group, except that they have no input in the reframing of the question. A more inert, more passive analogy would be better, something like doctrinal litmus paper. For the role of the laity on this model is purely passive. The teaching church, the ecclesia docens, essentially the bishops and clergy, is the active partner. The church taught, the ecclesia docta, essentially the lay faithful, is the passive partner. If the model is intended to find a role for the laity, it can only do so by taking their voice away. And perhaps worse still, it defines the role of the faithful in clericost categories. The faithful are what the clergy is not. They are what's left of the body of Christ when the active bit, the clergy, is taken out of the equation. Now you may notice that I've just been speaking of the clergy, whereas Newman, in most of the passages we have looked at, speaks of the body of bishops and the like. There is a slippage there between bishops and clergy, a linguistic jump, but I think that it's Newman that's making it, and not me. Look again, for example, at the wording of 1.7 on your handout. If there ever was an age which might dispense with the testimony of the faithful and leave the maintenance of the truth to the pastor of the church, it is the age in which we live. Though the laity be but the reflection or echo of the clergy in matters of faith, yet there is something in the pastorum et fidelium conspiratio which is not in the pastors alone. We have there a contrast between the faithful and the pastors, and a contrast between the laity and the clergy. And the two contrasts are simply identified. In speaking of the ecclesia docens, the teaching church, Newman and Wiseman and Olathorn will be thinking primarily and in the first instance of the bishops, but of the bishops surrounded by a cloud of their clergy. Newman's pastors, pastores, in the Latin tag he's quoting, preserves the ambiguity, which is itself simply a reflex of a highly clericalist understanding of the fundamental structures of the church. There is, though, one passage which perhaps points ahead to a richer and more complex vision. In 1.7, again, from the conclusion of the essay, Newman has occasion to remark that each constituent portion of the church has its proper functions, and no portion can safely be neglected. Each constituent portion, and not simply both sides of the lay clerical divide. In any event, On Consulting the Faithful is an important document, but one Newman himself was to leave behind. The Rambler saga was to lead him into troubled times. He fell under a cloud in Rome, which hung over him until 1867, when his closest friend and faithful disciple Ambrose St. John made the trip to Rome himself and managed to explain things to the satisfaction of the Secretary of Propaganda, Alessandro Cardinal Barnapo. There were also years when Newman had to endure the distrust both of the English hierarchy and of the English public. The latter, at least, to be partly dispelled by the publication of the hugely successful Apologia in 1864. He was also much preoccupied by thoughts of age and death. In letters of the period, he repeatedly refers to himself as an old man, though he was only 58 at the time of the Rambler affair. It could have been the end of creative and original work, but it wasn't, far from it. For well into his 70s, Newman was to develop a new and radical ecclesiology, one which in many ways we have yet to assimilate, one to which even Vatican II, perhaps, paid lip service rather than taking fully on board. The stimulus for this new ecclesiological turn was Vatican I, with its definition of papal infallibility. Newman had no trouble with the doctrine itself, and could certainly live with the way it was formulated at the Council. But he had an intense dislike both for the theology and for the style of ecclesiastical politicking introduced by the Ultramontanes in England. And his main worry, as so often, was for the converts, recent and potential. He was busy in these years, re-editing and reissuing his collected works. And in 1877 appeared a collection of texts from his Anglican youth, published in 2 volumes under the title The Via Media of the Anglican Church. The first volume contained the reissue of his most anti-Catholic work, first published 40 years before, in 1837, under the rather tendentious title Lectures on the Prophetical Office of the Church, viewed relatively to Romanism and popular Protestantism. The new edition also contained a new preface, 80 pages long, in which he brooded on the nature of the church. That's the other text I want to look at this afternoon. Take 2.1 on your handout. These offices, which especially belong to him as mediator, are commonly considered to be 3. He is prophet, priest, and king. Of course, he's picking up the idea of Christ as the anointed one, anointed to be prophet, priest, and king. And after his pattern, and in human measure, Holy Church has a triple office too. 3 offices, functions, roles, which are indivisible, though diverse, namely teaching, rule, and sacred ministry. Teaching as prophetic, rule as kingly, sacred ministry as priestly. And recasting what is essentially the same distinction, Christianity then is at once a philosophy, a political power, and a religious rite. As a religion, it is holy. As a philosophy, it is apostolic. As a political power, it is imperial, that is, one Catholic. As a religion, its special center of action is pastor and flock. As a philosophy, the schools, in the medieval sense of the theological faculties, the theological traditions of the great orders. As a rule, the papacy and the curia, one holy Catholic and apostolic. Truth is the guiding principle of theology and theological inquiries, devotion and edification of worship, and of government expedience. The instrument of theology is reasoning, of worship our emotional nature, of rule, command, and coercion. Further, in man as he is, reasoning tends to rationalism, devotion to superstition and enthusiasm, and power to ambition and tyranny. The Church, as we say in the Creed, is one holy Catholic and apostolic, and for the Newman of 1877, those 4 traditional notes of the Church are parceled out, as it were, among the 3 offices or functions. Those offices of prophet, priest, and king are in a complex systemic relation. They're in tension with one another. In and of themselves, they are, as he says, so divergent and so conflicting. There is between them collision and adjustment. Each has its characteristic fault. The prophets become abstract, speculative, and divorced from the real life of the church. The priests wallow in fuzzy-minded devotion. And the kings wear the jackboots of authoritarian power. But truth emerges precisely from that tension, from the functioning of the system as a system. So your privilege and your duty is to fight your corner, to get on as best you can with the job of being prophet or priest or king. For in this vision of ecclesial reality, you are called to be primarily one of those things. You are called to be primarily a prophet, or primarily a priest, or primarily a king. You specialize. So where in that vision of things do the laity belong? They don't, really. The lay-clerical divide is no longer what fundamentally structures the church. Of course, there is such a divide. The sacrament of order is simply a given. There are bishops and priests and deacons. There are and have to be. Newman was always convinced of that, from his evangelical youth to his dying day. But by 1877, that's no longer what fundamentally shapes how the church works and how she arrives at truth. For Newman, the priestly office is populated by both clergy and lay. He's thinking of the local worshiping community, priest and people together, working to make their bit of the world holy. The regal kingly office is for him populated by the higher clergy, the bishops, or as he says in 2.2, the papacy and the curia. And the prophetical office is for him also populated by clerics. That's the sphere of the schools. That's the corner where the professional, trained theologians ply their trade. And he assumes that as a matter of course, the professional, trained theologian is, at least normally, also going to be a priest. The May issue of the Rambler, that got Newman in such trouble, contained a letter that ended with the daring question, how far is it allowable or desirable for laymen to study theology? In a letter of 1857, he had declared that he was opposed to laymen writing theology, but the reason he gives is significant. On the same principle that I am against amateur doctors and still more lawyers. In other words, laymen had no business writing theology because they weren't properly trained. And yet, if we pressed him, I think that he would admit that that was a merely contingent fact about the world as it happened to be. Even in Newman's day, the occasional layman taught theology. His bête noire, W.G. Ward, his erstwhile disciple in Oxford days, and later the mischievous, provocative, and radically ultramontane editor of the Dublin Review, Ward was allowed to teach philosophy and theology for years at St. Edmund's Ware, despite the fact that some of its students were in training for the priesthood. A counterexample, which Newman notes himself in his letter to Acton of 31st December 1858, or perhaps we should say of the 1st of January 1859. He notes in the course of the letter that the clock is actually striking 12 as he's writing. If Newman were shown a world in which theologians were in which lay theologians were a commonplace, indeed a world in which we can celebrate lay women as doctors of the church, I think he would admit that there are more folk at work in the prophetical office than he had supposed. And even the kingly office, supremely the sphere of pope and bishops, is in a sense extendable. For we know in our world that so much of the work of the hierarchy is enabled and carried out by a multitude of commissions and by a multifarious officialdom. But we don't actually have to indulge in such special pleading to extend Newman's categories. He really does it for us himself. The scheme of the three offices, as rich and fruitful as it is just that. It's a schematization, a sort of diagrammatic view of a much more complex reality. We'll return to that complexity, that diversity in a moment. But for now, let's look at a key passage from quite far on in the preface. It's 2.4 on your handout, a long but important section. But as to the mere countenancing of superstitions, it must not be forgotten that our Lord himself, on one occasion, passed over the superstitious act of a woman who was in great trouble. He means the woman with the issue of blood who touched the hem of his garment. Passed it over for the merit of the faith, which was the real element in it. This woman, who is so prominently brought before us by three evangelists, doubtless understood that if the garment had virtue, this arose from its being Christ's. And so a poor Neapolitan crone who chatters to a crucifix refers that crucifix in her deep mental consciousness to an original who once hung upon a cross in flesh and blood. But if nevertheless she is puzzle-headed enough to assign virtue to it in itself, she does no more than the woman in the Gospel, who preferred to rely for a cure on a bit of cloth, which was our Lord's, to directly and honestly addressing him. Yet he praised her before the multitude, praised her for what might not without reason be called an idolatrous act. For in his new law, he was opening the meaning of the word idolatry and applying it to various sins, to the adoration paid to rich men, to the thirst after gain, to ambition and the pride of life. Idolatry is worse in his judgment than the idolatry of ignorance, but not commonly startling or shocking to educated minds. And may I not add that this aspect of our Lord's teaching is quite in keeping with the general drift of his discourses. Again and again he insists on the necessity of faith, but where does he insist on the danger of superstition? An infirmity which, taking human nature as it is the sure companion of faith when vivid and earnest. Taking human nature as it is, we may surely concede a little superstition as not the worst of evils, if it be the price of making sure of faith. Of course, it need not be the price, and the Church, in her teaching function, will ever be vigilant against the inroad of what is a degradation both of faith and of reason. Just now, I should be disposed to doubt whether that nation really had the faith, which is free in all its ranks and classes from all kinds and degrees of what is commonly considered superstition. Think of his lifelong horror of superstition. Rome reeked of it in 1833. In 1859, it's where the poorer classes will end up if left by the hierarchy to flounder. And still in 1877, superstition and enthusiasm is the characteristic fault of fuzzy-minded devotion running riot. And think, too, of his shock at Naples and Neapolitans with their very irreverent exhibitions of the crucifix. He must have seen the prototype of that poor Neapolitan crone chattering to a crucifix back in 1833. And yet, by 1877, he realizes that the Neapolitan crone has as much right to chatter to her crucifix as he, a doctor of divinity, has to read his Greek and Latin texts. It's simply her way of being a Catholic. Of course, he might think her puzzle-headed. He might try to persuade her that she's confused. Indeed, that's part of his job as an inhabitant of the prophetical office. But the old crone might think, if she could be bothered to do so, that he's living in an ivory tower and try to persuade him to get real. That's her privilege, and indeed part of her job. She's chattering to her crucifix as a denizen of the priestly office, working to make her bit of the world, her own life, holy. But by provoking his reflections on the idolatry of power and wealth, she's also, in her own way, being prophetic. We specialize in one of the offices or another, but our specialities inevitably flow into and interact with each other. Newman's letters of this period appeal over and over again to an image from Psalm 44:6, which in our versions reads something like, "At your right stands the queen in gold with Ophir," but which in the Latin of Newman's breviary speaks of the queen circumdata varietate, clothed in diversity. What, at the end of the day, is the role of the laity in the thought of John Henry Newman? simply to be there in all their diversity. And there, oddly enough, is a point of contact with a very different theological tradition. A point of contact with the thought of Thomas Aquinas, a theologian Newman admired and respected in theory, but couldn't warm to in practice. After all, Thomas was a red-blooded Aristotelian. Newman had from his youth been a fairly unreconstructed Platonist. Thomas was a theologian. Newman always disclaimed that label and called himself a historian. Thomas gave shape and expression to the high medieval synthesis. J.H.N., however much he might regret the fact, belonged to the modern world with all its anxieties and uncertainties. But just as Thomas has a vision of a world in which things are what they are precisely through being diverse, in which multiplicity and diversity isn't something to be overcome, but rather to be gloried in, as one of the ways in which is manifested the richness and the abundance of the God who lies behind it all. Just as that is so for Newman is the Church what she is precisely in her diversity, a queen circumdata varietate.